Now, Paul, just to bring you in, another top five priority was equal pay and pay equity. This is in the Mind the Gap report, part two. Now, what in practice can organisations do to address pay and pay equity disparities?
Thanks, Indy. I think that finding was consistent with what we've seen day to day. Organizations are really grappling with pay equity and trying to address this issue head on. I think this is an area where data really is king and paramount. Organizations have a tremendous amount of information about the way in which they pay their employees. They're able to analyze their data and identify gaps in pay for different groups, and they're able to address those in real time. On top of that, a well-done review of your data will allow you to identify root causes that may be contributing to pay gaps so that you don't simply fix past problems and repeat them annually year after year. So I think the key here from my perspective is that organizations really study their pay data, that they have a rhythm to do so on a regular basis, that executives at organizations are involved in championing those efforts, and that it becomes a regular part of an organization's processes. I have seen with clients that I have worked with for over a decade now on pay equity that while it can cause some pain in the short term, and there's a lot of dialogue around these changes initially, once it becomes part of the process, two things happen. One, it's no longer remarkable that there's a study being done and that equity is being assessed on a regular basis. And two, people start thinking about it. Managers start thinking about it in real time when they're making decisions. They get out in front of these issues and they start to identify when they hire people, when they promote people, when they rate individuals and they give them pay increases. They start to identify within their own little teams inequities that they solve without having us have to do it after the fact. So I'd like to step back here and talk about sort of just the scope of these sorts of pay equity reviews. I think, especially outside of the US, organizations are very good at studying gender pay gaps. And there's a lot of data out there on the gender pay gap, and companies are very attuned to looking at that information. In the US, it is also common to study race and ethnic groups. And that's becoming more common outside the US as well. We've seen a lot of organizations really driving to try to study pay gaps among racial and ethnic minority groups and to try to fix any inequities that are discovered. There are challenges to that. Monica mentioned this earlier. There are challenges to where you can collect that sort of race and ethnicity information. And so companies have to deal with that, but there are ways to try to encourage self-identification. This is an area where employee resource groups can be real champions for an organization. And even more recently, and this I think coincides with some of the findings of the Mind the Gap survey, we've seen organizations looking to try to expand pay studies to include LGBTQ plus groups, to include the disabled, to really try to study all of the underrepresented groups within the organization to see how their pay compares to others. Again, it's very hard to get the kind of data you need on who falls within each of those groups to undertake such a study, and you need to have the trust of your employees for self-identification, and that can present challenges. But what I think has really been a real push in the last couple of years that we've identified is that organizations really want to attack this from every possible angle. It is crucial to how people feel about how they are perceived within the organization, and it is important for retention, right? It's just sort of basic fairness, and companies are really focused on it from every perspective. And the reason that they're focused on it so heavily is really because there are pressures coming from every direction. We know in the US, in the UK, in a number of different jurisdictions, there are growing pay transparency obligations. Companies are being required to post this information on their websites, to make public the gaps in their data. And that puts pressure on an organization to get out in front of the issues before they're forced to air their dirty laundry publicly. On top of that, shareholder activist groups have become more and more prominent in this space. And so there are outside influences that are pushing companies to be more transparent about their pay, to conduct these studies, to fix pay gaps, and to report out what remains and what they plan to do to address it. And those groups are certainly making a difference. And third, and this shouldn't be understated, there are executive leaders who are champions of pay equity more and more every day. And so we see CEOs, C-suite officials who are demanding of their people that they have fair pay practices, that they've studied their data, and that they've taken the steps that they need to ensure as fair a process as possible. And so with all of those various pressures, I think more and more companies are looking at this sort of pay equity data and trying to get out in front of these issues. And that can include regression analyses, very sophisticated pay studies. It includes, at times, following up on individual complaints and really digging in on an individual basis to groups, to specific groups. And it involves remediation. Right? When you find these problems, organizations need to devote the resources necessary to fix them. And that almost always means increasing the pay of underpaid individuals, right? Rarely, if ever, do organizations decrease somebody's pay to create equity. It's about bringing people up. And so it involves an expenditure of resources. It requires a commitment, and we're seeing a more and more of an appetite for that. And I think it's important, if you're going to solve your overall I&D goals, that you get out in front of pay equity first.
Yeah, totally agree. Thanks, Paul. Really comprehensive. And I mean, now to the how. We've talked about the why, and I really love the idea that a lot of this is being driven by CEOs and C-suite executives. But how are organizations going about getting in front of these pay equity issues?
Yeah, it's a great question. Different organizations will solve this problem differently because the challenges are different. And so I'm a big believer, I think we all are here, that there's no one size fits all approach. Larger organizations have different pay challenges than smaller organizations. Depending upon the jurisdiction you're in, you may have different needs and requirements that you need to meet. But on the whole, I think for organizations of a sufficient size, there's a real need to look at your data and study it in a very sophisticated way, to try to identify similarly situated groups of people within your company and really study, after accounting for relevant and fair reasons people might be paid differently, where you have a pay gap and attacking those problems. And that's sort of an approach, again, it may vary by jurisdictions. There are certain things that you will want to consider in some places and not others. But on the whole, it's sort of a starting point that most organizations need to address. On top of that, I do think that there's a place for individual reviews of pay data to really dig into those areas, particularly if your studies are showing you that you have repeat groups. You remediate a problem, you see the same problem pop up the next year and the year after. Really digging in and trying to identify what is the root cause of this? How can we fix it? Is it the way in which we pay people? A lot of times organizations need to rethink their pay philosophies. And one of the things that these studies let organizations do is understand what pay decisions that they make that drive overall pay differences. So even if something can be explained, even if it's a characteristic that one can understand and explain, it may not be what the company wants going forward because it really desires to achieve equity. So a lot of times for organizations, we will say, from a legal perspective, I can defend this pay gap. From a I&D perspective, I don't want to. So help me figure out what is causing this difference, and we can help identify those issues. And then they have to rethink from a comp philosophy perspective. Do I need to do more internal promoting? Do I need to think differently about how I pay my internal promotees versus my external hires? All sorts of different things that may be contributing to a gap that are not illegal, but that are undesirable.